Welcome and good evening. This is an incredibly difficult evening for us all. Those of us who work on anti-racism day in, day out. Someone said to me earlier, it feels like trench warfare. It shouldn't feel like trench warfare on the evening on which we see the government's independent commission on racial and ethnic disparities set up 8 months ago after the murder of George Floyd, set up to investigate the extent to which racial injustice exists in this country, to find out now 8 months later that the government's report is telling us that it may or may not exist in an institutional form, and that there's been some progress made, but most of all, we are a model country in the UK. Now, I know that you can hear the sense of anger, the sense of frustration, all of the emotions that I know that you're feeling. So we wanted to gather us all here. We wanted to gather us all here so you could hear from some other leaders in the race equality sector and hear their thoughts and maybe mobilize together. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to introduce, I guess, for a moment, but what I did want to start off with is to just explain why I've ended up with an all-male panel over there. We had to organize this in a flash mob way, basically. We had to look out to see who's around, because, you know, race has been weaponized. We didn't have time to react. We thought across to who there was. We reached out to Marsha, Yvonne, and others. And these are the friends that reached out to us. So my apologies if this is not gender balanced, but yes, we are in the middle of trench warfare at the moment. I'm going to introduce you to our guests, our panelists who have been fighting anti-racism longer than I have. So it's an absolute honor to introduce you, first of all, to Lord Simon Woolley, who in the days of Operation Black Vote, Simon, you set up an entire new organization focused on increasing Black voter participation. And, you know, 25 odd years later, you're still working there, and now you're in the House of Lords and actually making a different argument, but still that activist that you were, and you've never really lost that. So we look forward to hearing from you. We also have Windrush campaigner Patrick Vernon, also another kind of veteran in this space, and we all wear different hats, Patrick, but the one hat that you're wearing at the moment, I feel, is just that really championing the voice of the Windrush generation that just got humiliated and degraded in that way. But you launched a campaign with many others to say enough is enough. This shouldn't happen in modern Britain. So thank you for joining us. And we've got Michael Hamilton, who works for the OBE initiative, you know, one of those new organizations that cropped up in the last 2 years to reset the conversation on racism and what Black and ethnic minority communities have to endure and how we stay resilient and how we fight back. So welcome, thank you for joining us in this conversation. Thank you also to the hundreds of people who have signed up to this YouTube channel. I sense your frustration. We're going to hear from you in the Q&As as well. So without wasting much time, I'm going to start with the first question. How disturbing is this report today? I'm going to go to Patrick for that first question.
Thanks for inviting me, Halima. I'm grateful for everyone online tonight. I've had so many messages in the last few hours of anger, despair, frustration. And, you know, we have to take the report with a pinch of salt. I don't think we should take it too seriously. I was interviewed on TV, Victoria Derbyshire show. I was wearing a Star Trek top. I'm a Trekkie. I'm not, this is like Black Panther, but no. And someone sent a message privately saying, "Why are you wearing that Star Trek top? This is a serious matter." It's not, because the report is in a parallel universe. That's how I see it. It's in a stratosphere, on another time continuum. And that report could have been drafted, reminds me of reports that were drafted in Britain in the 1960s and 70s when we were classed as immigrant children, and the whole stuff around being classed as education subnormal. And the message was, if we work hard enough, get good grades, we'll be all right. 40 years on, if we work hard enough, we get good grades, we'll be okay. It's a broken record. And we know full well that when Tony was approached to chair this report, we knew that I've known Tony for many years, and I've had a lot of battles with Tony. I'm sure we all have. But I know Tony on a regular basis because every year for the last, I've been involved with the Battle of Ideas for the last 5-6 years, and they have debates on all kind of topics to do with Britain, society. And I've always been on a panel with Tony and a whole range of people that's been involved in this report. So I knew where the parts are coming from. They don't believe in structural racism. So obviously when you have someone like Tony who is chairing this report, We knew that was going to happen anyway. The question was how he's going to style the report. And the report is styled in a way that we are victims, all of us. All people of colour are victims of our misfortune. And that's the first thing. And secondly, if you're stopped and search, it's your fault. If you've got mental health problems, it's your fault. If it's a maternal death, it's your fault. Actually, it's all our fault. And this is the kind of rhetoric that was used during the height of to justify slavery and enslavement and colonisation. And now we've got people, black and brown people, who are telling us what our ancestors had to deal with 400 years ago to justify slavery. Now they're telling us that we should be happy that we're in this country, and actually we're going to export this model to Denmark, Norway, maybe America. So the report itself, I don't think we should spend too much time getting angry regarding the report. I think that's what Simon said before we got online. We should look at the report, have a drink it, burn it, and then move on. And then we fight and we call out people. Some of the people that's been involved in this report, I'm not surprised by. Some of the people who have been involved in this report, I'm very disappointed by, who have signed their name to this. And I'm not trying. It's just the equivalent of a Holocaust denier being asked to develop a strategy on anti-Semitism. Half those people on there don't understand the history of Britain, or purport to don't understand the history of Britain. They don't understand the implications of enslavement. They don't understand modern day racism, and actually they don't really care about anything else apart from themselves. And the report is I don't think we should kill ourselves. We should just forget the report and do the real work. And as in the trilogy of the last Star Wars movie, the rise of Luke Skywalker, the main black actor in Star Wars, Billy D. Williams, said in the last battle scene of the Empire, there's more of us than them. There is more of us than them. So let's don't be despondent, everyone. We can fight this. And the final thing I have to say, Halima, as you know, with most government reports, when it comes to people of colour, they never get implemented anyway. I'll give it 6 months and I'll move on to another project.
I hear you, Patrick. I hear you. Like, contain that anger, think about it, channel it, don't focus on the report. And you're absolutely right. We are smarter, stronger than any instrumental report that is going to kind of trip us up, and it won't trip us up. But I would like to kind of focus a bit on that organizing bit, like our job, we know what to do, we'll carry on. So focusing on that, they have said, because remember, they will reset the narrative, and once you reset a narrative, public policy follows. So just on that point, they're saying this is a problem of the past. Racism is something that is historic, and we are haunted by historic issues. What do you think about that? Because I know, most certainly, looking at George Floyd's murder to COVID numbers of excess deaths, does that seem accurate to you, or is that a whitewash?
Well, let's face it, the report was commissioned by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who doesn't exactly have a track record in race equality and EDI in the first place, as we all know. And it was in the context of George Floyd and COVID. But reading this report, you wouldn't think we had George Floyd existed, or there was murder, or all the deaths in custody that's happened in Britain over the last 40, 50 years, or we even had a pandemic by reading this report. It's almost like it's in some kind of fairyland of, and that's what they're trying to create. It's like the Emperor's New Clothes. Who they're trying to convince? I think they're not going to convince us. Maybe they're convincing Middle England to say to Middle England, actually, it's not, Britain's okay. It's not a bad view. We've left Europe. Actually, we're going to teach Europe about race equality now. So actually, it's fine. Everything's hunky-dory. But as I said before, this report is predicated on the assumption that young people today who are at university or who are doing their A-levels, go to university, will get a good job and they'll be all right. The question I want to know, which is the report never even addressed, why is it that the NHS, the biggest employer in Britain, the largest employer of black and ethnic people in Britain, why is it there's less than 10 people who are chief executives of NHS organisations or medical directors? If you look at local government, it's a bit better, but it's not. But there's still. Why is it that in terms of public services, including the civil service and the FTSE 100 companies, why is it that there isn't that representation? If it's saying it's all about talent, then we should be running those places right now in 2021, but we're not. And the second thing the report tries to do is create a divide and rule strategy. They're comparing results of Chinese, Southeast Asian, and then Black African, Black Caribbean, creating this kind of battle of races. See, there you go, Black Caribbean people. They're a liability society. The kind of arguments that was used actually to justify the Windrush scandal.
Yes.
So how can they square the Windrush scandal? How can they square a year ago when the Williams report on the Windrush scandal, and yet we have the report from Tony Sewell, which does not acknowledge instance racism, and everything else to go with it. Talk to the victims of Windrush scandal; they will tell you something different about themselves, about subject age racism doesn't exist. 7 people have died in Britain connected with a government policy, but yet we are told things are nice and cool here.
It's a good segue, Patrick. So I'm thinking it would have been useful to have a victim of the Windrush scandal on that commission to talk to that issue, but of course they were not represented. So just staying with that segue, I'm going to go to Simon now. Simon, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, and I'm going to try and also move on to Michael while we can. But just to let you know, we've got over 1,000 people listening to this conversation. So think about our audience, think about our followers, think about all of us out there in our movement. Simon, so are we avoiding the real issues?
We are. This is a report that is steeped in denial. Actually, this report isn't for African, Asian, Caribbean, and other ethnic minority communities. It isn't for us. It's not for our consumption. They have a different audience, an audience which is probably white working class, middle England, that wants to tell them that because we focus on Black Lives Matter and the issues raised from the devastating impact that COVID has had on our communities and the hundreds of thousands of people that protested on the streets, never mind about that. If we focus on you, we might win your votes. I think it is reprehensible to position the heartache, the tragedy that we have had to endure to find a few grubby votes that say our attention's towards you and not to them. In these difficult times, what we're looking for, Halima, is leadership. Never in my lifetime, and I've been working in this area for far too long, have we had a society that saw the death of this man, now they're in trial in the USA, George Floyd, that saw the Black and brown faces dying in disproportionate numbers. And they said to themselves, Halima, something is profoundly wrong. The outcomes for many, many individuals, whether they are wanting to go into executive suite or whether they're stopped and searched, is unequal and often tragic. White people were saying, we need to do something about it. Now, we've never had that situation where people are susceptible, are ready to take an incredible journey. And what I would have liked to have seen is our society have a conversation that it's never had in our history. That is, the infrastructure, the institutions that we see around us every single day in law, in business, in academia, right across the piece, is too often predicated on a history that sees some people greater valued and other people less valued. We were ready for that conversation. There are many, but this government isn't. It's in denial. And if you're in denial, you can't fix anything. When the report began, the Prime Minister said, and Tony Sewell said, we need to change the narrative. We need these Black people to stop being in the victimhood culture. And so this whole process has been driven towards changing the narrative. And that's what the report is saying today. We have said very, very early on, listen to this good Prime Minister, if you want to change the narrative, change the systems that keep delivering inequality, that keep delivering the outcomes that work against the people. The narrative will change itself. It is a monumental moment missed in which we could not only, how can I put this, build back better, as people say, but build new better. Not just for generations of black and brown people, but for white people too. Instead, as Patrick rightly said, they're pitting poor white people against poor black people. And to me, it's reprehensible that we should use the politics of division for a few grubby votes.
It's interesting, Simon and Patrick, you've both said this is a fight for Middle England, and you've said this is a fight for the white working class vote. But do you know what? Middle England isn't that stupid. I think they see through this. I think it's smokescreens. They see what is happening. White working class people and black working class people can see exactly what's going on. They are not idealistic. They just want to see racism ended in this country. So I actually think they've miscalled it. They've judged it wrong. And I think the public will have a reckoning about this. Going on to Michael now, I'm going to slightly, kind of turn the question around for you, and then maybe get some questions from the audience. There was some shocking racist language about the slave trade in this report. I mean, I nearly fell off my chair. Did they say something about rewriting it as though it's a Caribbean experience somehow, something that you can buy off the shelf from Thomas Cook? What do you think, Michael, about the shocking way in which racist language was used in this report?
I think that, when I first looked at it and first kind of started thinking about it this morning, the thing about changing the narrative kind of struck me as being really important, because I think in the past year, the narrative had begun to change. Right. I know that at Ubele, we were getting calls from all sorts of people we didn't expect to be getting calls from, saying that something that happened in the United States has sparked something that is beginning to happen here. And I think that the government have moved in defense to push back the gains that were starting to be made since George Floyd. I think also they've done it in a really clever way, because they've got some black and brown people to speak on their behalf. And what we have to be careful of, I think, is that we don't go into a war with the other black and brown people, but we place this exactly where it is. And this is definitely in the arms of Boris Johnson. It's in the arms of his government. It's about arresting the movement that had started to happen with Middle England, because it was Middle England that were contacting Ubele and saying, what do we do? It was head teachers who were saying, how do we talk about race now? It was the executives of companies that were coming to us and saying, how do we move on race now? And I think that the most dangerous thing that this is doing at this moment of time is arresting that movement.
Absolutely, Michael, because it is a fight for the soul of Middle England, right? And that's what's so dangerous, isn't it? That is what they don't want. And this is what upsets me most, is I'm a lot older than maybe younger generations. For the first time in history, we don't feel like anti-racism is a bit of a Cinderella issue. It's something that everybody wants to talk to us about. It's not that conversation where you're having dinner and it suddenly props up and everybody leaves the room. We are now having the awkward, difficult, uncomfortable conversation, because most of us don't want to live with racism. And by most of us, I mean most white people. This is what's most dangerous, right? So I want to come back to a question from the audience here. They're saying, Amanda Parker asks, what is the best response then that takes Middle England with us? Because if that's where the fight is being fought, how do we bring Middle England with us? Because like I said, the public isn't that silly. The public sees through this. So how can we bring Middle England with us and obviously keep the confidence of black and ethnic minority people?
I would say to that, Halima, that in my journey for 25 years, I know to make change, we have to find allies. And we have to have a conversation that says what is good for Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities is good for wider society too, because we begin to unlock talent. We're comfortable with ourselves, that it's not a zero-sum game. My win is your win too. We do this together. And I think that if you have that conversation with Middle England, I mean, Michael is 100% right that never before in British society as senior business leaders said, if Black Lives Matter is to mean anything, what do I need to do? And they are engaging in that process. The government will have to catch up, by the way. But we have to find allies. We have to say this is in everybody's interest, that as we come into this Brexit world, uncertain world, this nation is going to need all its talent, all its creativity, all its dynamism. And so business will say, how do we unlock it? How do we nurture it? And then instead of trying to convince a government that are ideologically locked into a prism of saying that black is bad and white is good, that we will embrace our communities and go on a journey that will be really, really fruitful. And I think that's all we can do right now.
Someone's asking, maybe let's look at Patrick. Somebody's asking the question, because this report is so outrageous, and I get your point, Patrick, but let's not get obsessed with the report. It's a racial injustice that we should get upset with. But somebody's asking, are they trying to provoke us into a conversation and a reaction in order to kind of police the right to protest and so on? Is this happening in the backdrop against the way in which civil rights can be enacted in this country? So I'm obviously thinking about the police and sentencing bill and the kind of movement that saw the public hit out again on Sarah Everard stuff. Is this something about triggering us again in order to take away our rights and freedoms, or what else is happening, Patrick?
That could be the case, but don't give too much credit to the government. I don't think they've got a master plan where they're moving the jigsaw, they're moving the chess pieces to somehow control us and contain us. Far from it. It's just this report was a knee-jerk reaction. I'm sure Boris said to Tony, you know, do this report and I'll look after you. Write it in a way, and as has been articulated by Simon and Michael, the report is not for us. But we have to respond to the report, and I think it is about the allyship and those conversations. And I've been involved in lots of conversations with corporates, with local authorities and NHS people who want to do the right thing. It's unfortunate that the government is not creating the environment for that to flourish to do the right thing. So we have to do it without the government, to be quite honest, and work with those organisations, those leaders who are serious. Because I think what the report was trying to do was circumvent the conversations that were starting to happen already, conversations about national curriculum. Now, if you look at the recommendations, it wants to play down and talks about stuff. But for the last 20, 30 years, there's been a whole range of teachers, academics and writers that have been campaigning for an inclusive national curriculum. They talk about it as a recommendation, but we know that their recommendation is about celebrating and glorifying slavery. And I know that Michael said we shouldn't pick on people, but when you've got someone who represents the West India Committee, which was the committee that represented plantation owners, and that got the 30 million, that got the compensation around slavery in 1833, still influencing race equality in Britain, I find that anathema. I really do. You know, it's a big issue. So sometimes we may have to call people out that they're using propaganda and representing an organisation that enslaved my ancestors. Now they're telling us what is best on race equality. How dare you? I think we should be upfront about that. But we need to work with people and we need to work with organisations and we need to strategize. We need to work together. There's lots of anger out there, but we need to think it through. We need to learn from the history of the Windrush generation. One of the people that died, a dear person that both Simon and Michael knew very well, named Jocelyn Barrow. She died last year. She played a key role with black people, Asian people and white people together for the first Race Relations Act of 1965. That was allyship. We have lost that energy and that spirit that we used to have, and we need to bring it back again. We need to appeal to those people out there, working class people, white people who believe in social justice, to work together. Remember, there's more of us than them. Just remember that.
And that allyship, Patrick, I mean, a lot of people on the chat line are saying the way to bring Middle England with us is obviously to look at the places where Middle England has most invested in, which is the education system. And I suspect that is why the pressures from the kind of anti-woke lobby is focused on what happens in the national curriculum, what doesn't happen there. So reforming the education system or making the curriculum more reflective of our histories of empire and colonialism is obviously one way forward. So I think we can reflect on that. But I'm also wondering, about this point around division and divide and rule. It's right that we seek allyship. It's also right that we don't divide each other. So what's really interesting is, I mean, obviously they've tried to divide Black and working class people, then I'm going to come back to that thought again. But even within minority ethnic communities, there's a bit of a divisory tactic going on. If you pay attention to the language, they're saying, well, some minorities are doing well because they have really great mythical work ethics, and others are not because their family structures are broken and it's a lifestyle choice that they've made. Oh, and a lot of these snowflake generation people keep talking about microaggressions and things, and do they not know the difference between imposter syndrome and actual racism and systemic racism? What do you say to that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I say that this language of division can't work. And the reason I know it can't work was because when I was 15, I lived in Willesden Green, just around the corner from Grunwicks. And I remember the miners coming down by the coachload to support Asian workers when Asian women were under threat. And so I know that when we have the argument, when we work with our white and working class colleagues, when we work with middle class England, when we present the argument, we win the argument, and we'll certainly win this one. Yeah. It took me years and years and years of my life to understand that there are people in the world that believe something different to what I believe. Yeah. I believe that the report is a true reflection of where Boris Johnson is. I don't think it's a ruse or a rouse, I think it's a true reflection of what these people believe about
Where is he,
us.
Michael? Where is Boris Johnson at on this? Because you're absolutely right. It's not the rest of the commission. It's where our Prime Minister is at.
It's where our Prime Minister is about us. Yes, that these people think that we're lazy. They think that we use racism as an excuse for not achieving, for not doing. They believe all of these things about us. And what we have to do is that we have to continue to take that argument back to them. We can take the facts back to them. We have the numbers. We have countless reports written by both Black people, brown people, and white people that completely tear this apart. And so what we need to do is that we need to go back, as Simon says, to our allies, and we need to mobilize them around this and allow them to recognize that when we're mobilizing around this, it's not just Black people that gain, it's the whole society that gains. Yeah, and
Michael, where their argument doesn't stack up is that the report says the focus should be on white working class children because they lack aspirations. And then they pivot to Black, Asian and minority parents who they say have full of aspiration, and that's why we're doing well. You can't have it both ways. You can't say that we are lazy and then say, yeah, but we have aspiration and it's the white working class. Yes, our families have aspiration, educational aspiration. We've always known that it's a way out of poverty. And yet we still know within that education system, with all the aspiration that our families have, unless our children have their exam papers marked blindly, they do worse, considerably worse. And even when they get the results, when they go for the jobs, they've got to apply 8 times more just to get an interview. Now, these factors, Halima, are systemic, and you have to deal with it systemic. It isn't just the one bad apple. It's the same as it's not stop and search. It isn't just the one bad apple. Because, you know, when we was in lockdown in the summer of last year, 95% of society is in lockdown, yet stop and search for Black youths went up 25%. Meant that police officers were driving around London and big cities, stopping a Black person, I smell marijuana, as though they had nothing else to do. These are systemic problems, and we have to call them out and demand the change, because it's poisoning these young men and women who have to confront this brutality, this humiliation at the hands of law enforcement officers that should be protecting them. It is something that when we seen it in the States, in the worst case scenario, that fatal, lethal force can kill a man, that we know we're not a million miles away from that here. And then structurally, things must change.
And they will change, Simon. And we're just going to keep on that structure piece for a moment. We've got 1,600 people watching, and others sort of asking the question, if this group is so intent on explaining the existence of structural racism, and there's another group out there that says that it's not actually real. I just want to come back to that a little bit, because you're all going to go into your spaces and to talk about structural racism, I hope, because that's how we need to kind of mobilize our followers. Can I just ask each of you, if you had to explain structural racism or institutional racism in a nutshell, so that people don't say, oh, they've misunderstood unconscious bias or microaggression, what does structural and institutional racism mean to you, and why is it so relevant to our agenda on Black Lives Matter today? I'll go over to Patrick for that one.
Oh, well, there's different ways of breaking it down.
And very briefly, so that we
very briefly.
Yeah.
So to me, structural racism is linked to power, and that power is linked to privilege, and that privilege has been based on 400 years of enslavement and colonization. So look at the cabinet. Look at the boards of the FTSE 100 companies. Look at the boards of local authorities, NHS boards. You will see maybe, if you're lucky, 1 or 2 people of colour on those boards, and it's entrenched. So when people talk about affirmative action or positive action, it's the other way around. There've been 400 years of affirmative action, but we've not been the beneficiaries of that. It's been white men who've been beneficiaries of that. And as Michael said, I think the report articulates Boris Johnson's worldview that all these pickaninnies out there and all these women in hijabs or letterboxes are bringing down Britain. It's those good Asians over there, those good Chinese, those good Africans over there. They're doing a good job, and the Caribbean people, well, there's no time for them. This is the heart of structural racism: divide and rule. It was used during enslavement. It was used during colonization. It was used in Britain in the 50s and 60s. And then the government and Boris is trying to do the same thing again. This is like another version of Rivers of Blood, but this is based on us. We're the victims, and we're the perpetrators of our own misfortunes.
And therefore, if we succeed, it's on us. If we fail, it's on us. The state has no responsibility in taking care, or a collective duty of care around our outcomes if they're disproportionate. And our outcomes in COVID have been devastatingly disproportionate. So when they say institutional racism doesn't exist, take that figure of 64% of doctors and nurses to die from COVID from Black and ethnic minority communities. And by the way, nurses and doctors tend not to be poor, I take it. They tend to be middle class, but they still died. Why did they die? Because that young Black nurse didn't have the confidence of her white manager to say, do you know what? I'm actually going to face a lot of exposure and I don't want to go to work. She didn't have that confidence because her voice isn't heard. That's structural racism. Yeah,
and there's another thing that underlying the whole COVID stuff as well in terms of response is the veil of eugenics that slightly permeates itself in the government's thinking and the report. And if Dominic Cummings was still around in number 10, the report would be even more explicit about that.
God, yeah, I'm going to stop on Dominic and eugenics. I think that could be a very dangerous avenue. So just on that point, Michael, just very briefly, institutional racism, why does it matter? Why does it exist? And why are we so concerned that the government is focused on it?
Yeah, I think that what it is, I was trying to think of how do you really simply answer this? And I think I simply answer it by saying it's when forces come together which deny people of color power and opportunity within a society. And it's almost as simple as that a whole series of forces come together which deny us opportunity, which deny us power, and which deny us our kind of the benefits that we should be reaping from the society that we're a part of.
Good answer. And also Simon.
Sure, I'll try and
maybe
be
on the
succinct.
Political side, what do you think?
No, I would try and be succinct. I mean, I would say that structural racism maintains an order of white supremacy. Now, then you have to illustrate that. And one of the best ways to illustrate it is, here you have our jewel in the crown, the National Health Service, in which you have 40% of those people saving lives, making their vocation to look after people. 40%, but at a senior level, less than 2%. And so they are less than, they're okay as long as they're on the bottom run, but they can't come up. That is the structural inequality that says we are better than you. Now, let's look at it on a global level. I think that's really important too, because this is a small part of that. And to me, that was best illustrated a few weeks ago when the head of the World Health Authority said this: we have 60 million vaccinations that have been undertaken across the world, 60 million. And within the poorest countries of the world, many of those African, the majority of those African, we have unveiled 25 vaccination. That's 25, by the way. And when you see an order that is saying, we're all in this together, we all need to do the, you see the structural inequality that says you are valued, you are less valued. And here's the central point. This double pandemic has given us the opportunity to honestly confront this and fantastically do something about it. But you can't do it if you're in denial.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what, whenever people ask me that question, how do you, what is institutional racism? And that is essentially Middle England asking most of the time, because they want to understand and they want to be allies. What I end up saying is that, you know, hypothetically, the best of us are liberals, you know, so I am an anti-racist through and through. There's no denial about that. I am an anti-racist. However, if I choose to take a job in the Metropolitan Police, I am bound into a contract that says that policing needs to be racialized, so that when I carry out stop and search policies, I will inevitably stop young Black men and young Muslim men, because that's part of the intelligence-led policing system that I am forced to implement. That isn't because I'm individually racist, it's because the system that I walked into is based on racism. That's institutional racism. So you take away the responsibility of racism from an individual who might not have a racial intent, by the way. And those that do are obviously the bad apples. And we're not just concerned about the bad apples, we're concerned about the way in which the system can reinforce the behavior of bad apples. If it was just one bad apple, we could deal with it. Like I could individually deal with a racist. What I can't individually deal with is a whole police system that stops and searches young Black men and young Muslim men at the level at which they grow up thinking that this country doesn't have its back. And then they're mistrustful of the police. And then when COVID hits, you know, there's an issue around whether they take the vaccine, and you wonder why they're mistrustful. Well, are they going to build their trust overnight? No, because this has been an institutionally racist experience for them. And that's the difference between a young Black person who faces the police and a middle-aged white woman who faces the police. Of course she trusts the police, but a young Black person probably doesn't, because our life experiences have been different. That's how I explain structural and institutional racism, and that level of empathy and understanding of vulnerability and risk that our communities face wasn't there in that report, was it? It just wasn't there. I mean, at the very least, they could have acknowledged the deep-seated impact of COVID on our communities. At the very least, they could have done that, but they didn't.
Well, because that wasn't the purpose of the report. The purpose of the report was to say that if you work hard, keep your head down, you'll be all right. So that wasn't the purpose. I mean, the report didn't even look at the impact of discrimination, racism. I mean, there's more and more evidence around the impact of racism on our physical health, on our mental health. You know, I mean, and half the report itself is a sop in many ways. And that's why I take it with a pinch of salt, but we have to respond in a really powerful way and work with those organisations who want to make a difference. The report itself is not based; it's based on individual aspiration. It's a kind of if you look at when at the time of after the American War, Civil War in America, you had the likes of Booker T. Washington and Fred Douglass. And I mean, I think what the report is saying, do you want to have a Booker T. Washington model? You know, work hard, apprenticeships. Don't talk about Jim Crow. Don't talk about racism. Keep your head down, and you know, and you'll be lucky. You'll be looked after. That never happened because during that period there was a high level of lynchings of African American men, and required someone like Ida B. Wells, who a campaigner, one of the early civil rights campaigners in terms of the last century, doing evidence research work, unlike this government, on lynchings, and then talk about righting the wrongs. which has been plagiarised by this current government about righting the wrongs. This report is not about righting the wrongs. More important, the report doesn't even acknowledge anti-blackness or Afrophobia with an I, which that was one of the big issues around Black Lives Matter. It's about Black Lives Matter. This report says Black lives only matter if you do well at school. Then we might allow you.
So you have to be 10
Then
times
we
brighter
might
than
allow
your
you to go to university, but we're not going to allow you to get jobs. And I mean, you know,
Well, you can get a job, but you know, only jobs that we will tell you to get.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that it does do, and I think Halima, when you opened, you kind of hinted at it, is it then begins to drip down from just that report in terms of government. And so it will drip down in terms of what will be funded, what won't be funded, what will be valued, what won't be valued, who will be emboldened and who won't be emboldened. And so we have, you know, we have the chief of the Metropolitan Police denying institutional racism, yeah, and now has a source that backs her up in what she was saying. And so it's not just the report in itself, but it's actually the direction in which we are likely to be moving unless we can kind of arrest that movement pretty quickly, I think.
And we will arrest it, Michael. I mean, this is one thing I'm observing, you know, between last night and right now is that obviously those of us who kind of read reports like this were angry a lot earlier, but actually as other people are kind of finishing their day's work, or you know, a young nurse or an older nurse is coming back home after a shift and they're seeing what has come out of this government, I think the penny's dropped, hasn't it? I mean, it's been a blessing. I think everybody can see what has happened, and it means that we can mobilize. We can mobilize the Middle England and those of us who aren't Middle England as well, right? We're not divided. So I actually think it's a blessing because the whole country can see that the government is gaslighting us. The country can see it. You know, it's an own goal, isn't it? If they thought they wanted to go after Middle England, they've just lost them. So, but I will, you know, try and do my kind of Jeremy Paxman or Newsnight moment now. And just to be fair and balanced, I will ask the question, is there anything positive in this report, Simon?
Yes, there is. I mean, it talks about the fantastic aspiration of families that have driven change through inspiring children. I mean, we've all had the conversation with our children. It's an awful cliche, but you have to do it. I mean, how many of us have driven our children crazy? You have to do your homework. You have to avoid problems. You have to, I know you feel wronged by the teacher, but let it go. And I think it's this constant guiding, constant encouraging, constant ensuring that we can help them navigate through these pitfalls. I mean, they're tired of hearing it. We're tired of telling it, but it's helped. It's helped them. So in spite of all the obstacles, in spite of all the pitfalls, you know, it is amazing that so many come through and go on to university and do great things. But you know this, Halima, and this became very clear to me just last week when I read the Guardian report about the head teachers that have dealt with systemic racism on a daily basis. And I'm going to swear, it's bloody tiring. It's bloody tiring that you have to steel yourself for this journey. And we are equipping our children with such resilience. But the fact that this report highlighted what us as parents and carers and broader families do, I think is absolutely right.
And that is positive, Simon, that is positive. But by the government's own admission, they've said that the progress that we see in minority education attainments is down to parents, communities. It's down to us. Question still arises, well, what will government do to kind of support and nurture that incredible commitment to this country and the young people's futures in our communities? And that I haven't seen. However, I will come back to the rest of the panel and ask that same question. What is positive in this report, Michael?
I think the response to it has been positive. I'm not sure that I can find anything in the report that was particularly positive, but I think the broadness of people who have come out and have been on our television screens today and have been on our radio programs today and who have written and who have, if I look at the Ubele, we have a kind of Ubele WhatsApp group, And if I look at the way that that kind of blew up today, that the way that it gives another space in which we can pull together to have that argument, to defend ourselves and each other, has been an amazing thing. And if we can hold that energy going forward, I think you're absolutely right. We can defeat completely the narrative that's coming out through this report.
And is rather than repeat the same question for Patrick, and I'm going to start kind of summarizing a little bit. Patrick, is leveling up the new narrative, and what does that suggest? Is that a different way of tackling inequality or just race equality? Does leveling up apply to Black and ethnic minorities, or does it apply elsewhere?
Well, the concept of leveling up has been used in kind of housing, planning, regeneration for many years, comparing different neighborhoods or comparing the North and South divide around leveling up around economics as well. So, you know, and we live in those neighborhoods anyway. So I think that expression is used, but leveling up from what? I mean, you've got, what's the starting point of the leveling up? And we recognize that certain communities have been leveled down, not leveled up. You know, so I think that's, I mean, the bit of the report I was interested in is the health, because I do a lot of work in health. So the report was interested in having this office of health, this new office, this new kind of Kwango, which looks similar to the Race Observatory, which has just been launched by NHS Confederation recently. But they modelled that recommendation on the work in America around the ethnic minority health units in America, which I remember some years ago, I met some of the officials there, and we do need to have a strategic focus on tackling health inequalities affecting Black and ethnic minority communities. I mean, I was a director of a health action zone many years ago. I think we should bring back health action zones and target resources, joint commissioning, and making sure that we are in the driving seat around co-production, co-creation of ideas. If it can do that, that'd be fantastic. But I'm not quite sure if it's got the energy to do that or the will to do that. But there's something you could build on that around tackling. I mean, only this week there was a TV program on the massive discrepancies in maternal death affecting Black women. That has been a problem for the last 30 years. That's not been addressed. There's significant overrepresentation of Black people in the psychiatric system. That's not been addressed at all for the last 30, 40 years. But the question is, who's going to drive that? Unfortunately, it's going to be down to us to do that work, that legwork again.
Yes, and just in terms of thinking about the outcomes, I think one of the outcomes is probably the movement, that coming together and seeing through all the kind of smokes and screens on racial injustice. You know, it's a bit like, you know, Black Lives Matter movement or climate change. You know, everybody hit the streets. People want more, and if you don't meet those demands, then we will organize despite you. So government, if you want to follow, do. If you don't follow, step aside. We will organize anyway. So I suppose one of the outcomes is that this movement will organize, and let's organize. Now, on that note, I want to think around unity and what that movement really is, because let's not forget, like the nurses on the front line that died of COVID were Filipino nurses as well. The racism that we've seen in Southeast Asian communities, I mean, that has been phenomenally spiked, right? And that's something that we need to be looking at as well. So all of our communities have a chance to come together. Now, thinking about that, at the Runnymede Trust, we've been thinking very hard about the government's report and how we need to mobilize and organize weeks ahead, by the way. You know, we had various scenarios, like, is it going to be a bit of a letdown or a massive letdown, or is it going to be a gaslighting outcome? You decide what it is. But so we did launch a petition for the government to respond to, and that petition was focused on commencing. Now I'm going to just go into a bit of a nerdy territory, because I know we've got people here that don't do policy but are listening, over 1,000 people listening. As part of the Government Equality Act from 2010, a number of things were missing from it. And one of the things that's missing from it, there's legislation to protect you from racism, there's legislation to protect you from homophobia, etc. But there's no legislation there to protect you from class prejudice. Like if you drop your P's and Q's and if you are discriminated against because you're working class, that protection doesn't exist in law. But there's a bit of legislation that's sitting there and all this government has to do is just push it, nudge it along and commence it, that would mean that white working class children and black or Asian working class children would be protected in many ways. So we've launched a petition out in the public, sign it, come together to commence a socioeconomic duty. And we feel that if this government is a friend of the working class, they would listen to us. Because what they've done for this commission is suggest that racism isn't a huge problem, inequality in class is. Well, if that is the case, put your money where your mouth is, commence the socioeconomic duty in the Equalities Act. So I want to ask all our followers out there, sign the petition, hold this government to account. We can come together. If we can protect class in this country and if we can protect race, imagine how powerful we would be. So with that thought in mind, when you go off and talk to your friends and allies for the next couple of weeks, think about that broad-based movement. And I just want to take this opportunity now to thank Patrick, thanks Simon, thank you Michael, thank you to I think 1,700 people listening in for joining us on a Wednesday evening when you've got so much else to do at home with children, family and caregiving. You've given up your time to be here with us, listen to us. I'm feeling energized. I know that this isn't the end, it's the beginning, isn't it? So thank you for joining us and don't give up the passion. Keep building, keep organizing, follow us all, link out to each other. We're the Runnymede Trust. We've been here since 1968. We're not going anywhere. We're going to fight till the last day until every life matters, particularly Black Lives Matter. We're not going anywhere. Thank you everybody for listening and enjoy.